Okay, good morning everyone. Hopefully we are live now. So if you're all comfortable, I'll begin. So today we're going to talk about landing zones and how they are a foundational building block within that cloud adoption framework. And I'll guide you through some of the principles, why you need it and what's involved. So a little bit about me initially. My name is Leon Godwin. I am the Principal Cloud Evangelist here at Cloud Direct. And my role is, I do not work in sales. My role is to share the knowledge and experience I have, which is substantial, with colleagues, customers, prospects, to help them accelerate their cloud journey. I also act as the technical voice for the customer. So as I engage with you guys, I feedback the insights from that engagement into the business, into various parts of the business, such as the product teams, and marketing teams, etc. So I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and here is a good chance for you to do a quick screen grab and you've got my email, my LinkedIn, and my Twitter account. Now, what I will say is I'm actually dropping, I think about 10:30. I have a bit of a long form post about landing zones dropping onto my LinkedIn. So you might want to go and enjoy that. Okay, so we're going to talk about how is the foundation, put it in context, understand what it is and how you might design for it, and a bit of an examination on use cases. So I like these things to be interactive. So if you have any questions, don't be shy. Just stick them in the chat box. Beth will be monitoring the chat window and will come to me with any questions, and we'll sort of round those up towards the end. So what is a landing zone? So a landing zone it's a critical component, and it's often a component organizations miss out, especially when they started off experimenting with Azure initially and then moved to more of a production mode. Some of those foundational principles might have been missed. So it is responsible for scalability and modularity of your hosting environment, of your workloads and applications, and it's a key component of the cloud adoption framework. So why would people choose to adopt Azure? There are some standard motivators for why people choose to adopt Azure. And by adopt Azure, I'm not necessarily just saying going to Azure. You may already be in Azure, but it's adopting additional services. So it can be anywhere along that spectrum. Now, common things we see is they've got a data center contract, or their hardware is coming end of life. So those are the sort of compelling events, and they need specific activity, and they need to do some integration quickly. I've seen that quite a lot, where as a result of a merger or acquisition, they need to ramp up the acquired organization, and maybe using things like Azure Virtual Desktop to quickly get them on board, whilst a longer term integration is planned in the background. There may be specific security threats you have experienced in the previous organization. 40% of customers were consuming a particular service after security incidents. It might be that achieving compliance is going to be easier in the cloud, or you're looking to innovate within the application stack. So the capabilities in Azure when it comes to the likes of GPT and AI are profound and much cheaper than you think. In fact, I'm going to be doing a talk on that tomorrow in Bath. It's much easier and cheaper to start using some of these cutting edge AI technologies. And of course, you might have software coming to end of life. So some of these may resonate with some of you listening as to being the sort of compelling events that you might be experiencing, or compelling reasons to increase or initially adopt Azure. So, do any of these things resonate with you? Do you have all the in-house skills you need to adopt Azure? Do you have the intent of following best practice? Are you in a position where you could do with some technical guidance? Are you maybe already in Azure, but you're not convinced it's actually aligned with best practice? Or are you already in Azure and you're experiencing, you're looking to go to Azure, but the cost of migration seems prohibitive? Well, if that is the case, there are solutions. You can partner with an expert MSP. There are a little over 100 globally, a handful in the UK, of which we are one of them. You can apply for migration funding, and this is a step often missed. We have many organisations that have applied for and succeeded in getting funding, and I can touch on that a little later. The idea is you follow that cloud adoption framework, which is a set of guidelines of how you migrate and scale and adopt Microsoft Azure effectively, and as well as building out your landing zones and applying the associated policies within that landing zone to make sure it's scalable and secure and compliant. So that's the problem is on the left. If that resonates with you, then this call's definitely for you, and I'll touch on some of the elements on the right within this. So when it comes to the cloud adoption framework, it is, as I mentioned, it's a sort of roadmap for how you can achieve success in the cloud. So it starts off with education and training, maybe something like this webinar. Then you would move into the governance and the rules and basically planning ahead of time what it is you want to get out of Azure. And that would be, maybe you would be doing your design documents, you'd be understanding what your goals and intentions are and what policies you might wish to apply. And then you would build out your base infrastructure. And the base infrastructure is effectively the cloud adoption framework. So this is what you're going to build before you move into your workloads into the cloud. And then there are additional steps in terms of assessing your specific applications, your migration, your onboarding, and optionally, if you need any support, then we can obviously help with that. So, defining your strategy. What is it you want to achieve? How is Azure going to help align with your business strategy? What technologies are you hoping to leverage and exploit? And how is ultimately Azure going to help with that? And then when you understand those, you move into a planning phase, saying, okay, do I have the skills to deliver this? Perhaps if you're on this call, perhaps you've answered actually not sufficiently, and that's why I'm looking for assistance. Do I understand my estate? Have you done that assessment and understand the intricacies of the performance levels and what the target platform can offer? So just on that point, when you migrate to Azure, you may find yourself, let's say, an on-premise VMware environment, incredibly common, where you're oversubscribing, you have a physical CPU to virtual CPU ratio that isn't one-to-one, but when you move to the cloud, it is one-to-one, which means you can actually be in a position where two CPUs that are 5 years old, or two virtual CPU cores that are 5 years old, actually are less performant than one vCPU in the cloud, because Azure does one-to-one mapping. So understanding your estate and your needs, don't buy what you have, buy what you need. And then what your security considerations, how can they help? And then this is the crux of today. We will build out a landing zone, establishing those security and compliance and cost controls within that estate. And then you move on to migration, and then across that planning, readiness and adopt stage, you have the principles of governing in terms of what you're planning to do, and when you've adopted, you want to manage that, and that runs across the piece. So going into what is a landing zone? So a landing zone is kind of your digital scaffolding that you build. If you were building a house, a row of houses on the street, you would start off with your scaffolding that enables you to build your walls. Let's call that your security. You would have a key that you put in your front door. That would be your identity access management. You would partition up the interior of the house into rooms. Maybe that's your virtual networks. All these things would be built and configured, aligned to best practice, in a way that you can repeat that down the whole street because it's scalable and it's modular. Once you've got those set of rules for one, that's a template you can roll out again and again and again. We've done this for organizations that have, they say, to be deployed to the APAC region, and for sovereignty reasons, they also need to have an instance in another region. Because they've got their modular controls, they can just copy, paste. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but effectively, here's my template. I will deploy my template and spin everything up in my new environment. So just like my analogy about building a house, you wouldn't put your furniture in the house until the walls are built. Neither would you with when it comes to Azure and landing zones. So it is your digital scaffolding for cloud. And it's built on effectively 5 key principles. What are the network services you need? What are their controls? What's their configuration? And how are they best optimized to deliver the outcome? What are your security requirements and controls, and how might we implement them? What are your identity access management controls that you want to put in place? And how might that differentiate from best practice? What is your governance strategy? How are you going to manage these things? So let's take an example. People talk about cost control, but you might be monitoring your element, your solution for cost. But how do you determine whether that cost has value? So, for example, a proof of concept isn't necessarily generating any revenue, it's spending money, but further down the line it might. So having that governance strategy that just says, not only have I got my budget, not only have I got my alerts and monitoring, I've also got my ability to evaluate what do I do when I find something is not appropriate or delivering is exceeding those boundaries, but that might actually be acceptable because you are innovating, you're experimenting. That may be appropriate. Have you got the governance strategy in place? And overall, what's your ongoing management strategy for maintaining those environments? Where are you getting your monitoring insights from? Where are you dealing with your patch management? And just generally, how are you going to maintain these environments going forward? And this is what a landing zone helps take care of. So many of you are probably familiar with the concept of Active Directory in Windows. In this particular context, it is more complicated, but it's similar in as much as it's a hierarchical structure. So you have this concept of management groups. A management group sits at the tenancy level. You have many subscriptions inside a tenancy, but the management group sits beyond those and above those. And much like you might have an OU structure within Active Directory with your various group policies applied, so you would have your management groups sat at the top of your organization, and you would configure those based on the needs of your organization and ultimately the target operating model. So you need to define those. What are they and how should they be configured? Then you would have your subscriptions. Now, how would you design your subscriptions? In this model here, you can see that it's geography based. So based on the geography, we're going to spin up different subscriptions for different services. In this case, the structure is production, development and test, and we build out those accordingly. So it looks like in this model, development and testing is done in the UK, not in Spain and the US. And then we can move into the specific resources. So you'll have your applications and your resource groups with your networking and whatever, and your resource group is basically it's like a group in Active Directory that a bunch of users or other groups might go in an Active Directory. In Active Directory, in this context, it might be your servers, your workloads, your disk, your virtual networking, your load balancing, etc., etc. So these are your resource groups. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because you can apply policies at any level. So part of your design consideration when building out your landing zone is saying, okay, I need to define my management groups, and I will apply policies that will apply, so for example, at the corporate IT level, everybody, no matter who you are and what organization, you have to have antivirus. So that might be a policy that applies at the top level. There may be different controls you have in place for testing and development that you might have in production, and so you can apply those controls. However, there may be specific geographic constraints within your subscriptions, depending on how you've divided them, and you might want to apply policies different in Spain and the UK versus how you apply them in America. Or indeed, you can apply your policies against the individual resource groups, or indeed against those resources. So you have that ability to be able to tier, just like you would with group policy in Windows Active Directory. You can apply your group policy to a parent OU or a smaller down the train. It's a similar principle. It's a hierarchical structure where you can go and apply your controls and policies. Now, when it comes to designing those, you are not, in this example, we've pivoted away from a geographic example where we might want to separate based on business criticality. So we've got our standardized environments for production, but there's also an isolated environment because that is maybe handling payment card information. And then there's critical information because that's where your core business applications reside that contain the most sensitive information. So how do you design your subscriptions, and how would you then apply your policies against those subscriptions? These are considerations you have to make when deploying a landing zone. Because once you've done this, and if you've done, you can see if you've built that set of policies and structure for standard, it's very easy to roll it out from test, dev to production, because it's already defined and you can just increase the scope of that. Or indeed, if it was in a different place in the world, you can just roll that out very, very simply. So that's what makes it modular, highly scalable. And again, you may want to consider how you structure your resource groups. There are a lot of resources in Azure, just even a single virtual machine that you might think of in, say, the context of VMware, a virtual network card. We'll have a public IP address, we'll have storage disks, we'll have a compute component, might have a monitoring component, might have some storage for that monitoring component, might have a load balancer, might have some other specific modules or components within that IaaS type infrastructure. All of these are effectively almost like line items within your resource group. So what is going to be the structure of your resource groups? What's best practice, and how does it make sense for you to control and manage those? Maybe you want to be able to get visibility into what sales are spending versus what finance are spending. So maybe you want to structure your resource groups like that. Maybe you want to structure it at a subscription level. So these are all the design considerations that you need to make when adopting best practice in Azure. So if I look at a specific example, you've probably experienced this. In fact, if you've got Microsoft 365 already and you go to the admin portal, you'll see that you have your default tenancy address, which is presumably some customer name, probably .onmicrosoft.com. But you can give the vanity domain, clouddirect.net, whatever it may be. But ultimately, there is a tenancy that is the root that everything else is contained in. And there is, in fact, a bunch of best practices here. For example, a single user account in here should be so heavily secured and never, ever used. Because that's a kind of in case of emergency, break glass, and it's the sort of thing where it's security, it's password, encryption keys, whatever, are stored in a fireproof safe. As a general rule, no one should be using that day to day. It doesn't lose you any controls or right of access, but it does mean that at parent level, should your details become compromised, you have a place of last resort to go to, well, without contacting Microsoft, that is. So then you might want to look at maybe a structure for your cloud governance and apply your policies there. Maybe you want to set up your individual payment policies. Maybe you want to create your subscriptions here, and I don't know if you can see here, I've got the landing zones, and within this landing zone here, I've got my identity access management. I've got my broader policies that are mentioned here that are applied at a subscription level. I've got my resource groups for my various components. Maybe I want to separate them out by different types of things. I've got my shared services that I might be using. That might be Azure Active Directory, for example. I might have applied my management and monitoring policies, controls and technologies up there. And then I've got my localized network stack for those particular components. And maybe that is identical because development and production probably need to be similar. Maybe don't have the same scale, but logically they're the same. So we can build it for one, deploy it to the other. And then when we make a change to one, we make a change to the other, keeping them consistent. And then maybe you are subject to PCI DSS. So, which is your payment cards. If you're processing credit cards and you have a card data execution environment, you would put controls in here that might not exist over here to ensure you meet the latest PCI DSS standards, which actually it's a little bit newer than that now. So you get the idea. The structure is, the landing zone is a set of structure. It allows you to scale because it's modular. It allows you to provide governance either at the top, middle or bottom of the layer to go and achieve your objectives. It allows you to put your cost controls in place that deliver the insights you need to be able to manage your estate. Many organizations have this approach where they will deliver a they will experiment within Azure, and maybe, oh, first of all, I probably need to put an Active Directory up there, and we'll create a little group and we'll stick those resources up there. But they're not, it's not against best practice. So then what happens is as you do start to scale within Azure, you find yourself with issues. Maybe you're not optimizing your costs correctly. Maybe you're not optimizing your security. Maybe you're introducing security flaws that weren't there before. So taking this is 101. Anybody who is adopting Azure should be thinking about this. You can do things like you can tag your resources, and those tags are like little bits of metadata that you can assign. So you can turn around and say operational, okay, a tag operational weekends, and you can put either a value of no or yes, and then you can have a policy that goes out and says anything that has operational weekends, no, it powers them down, saving you money. There's so many different things that you can do when it comes to best practice to optimize, and the landing zone is the enabler of that. When you design that correctly, you can then exploit all the other best practice capabilities. So a very common example is a hub and spoke model. Now, this isn't right for every organization, but it is, I would say, 50% of organizations do adopt a hub and spoke model. So you might have your, down at the bottom here, we've got your, you've got your users, maybe that's me working at home, maybe that's our corporate head office, and then maybe that's one of our other offices, could be anywhere else in the globe. And then you would have connectivity into that environment. And maybe that's your hub. Maybe that's where you're going to put all your controls in place. This is very common in public sector organizations because they want a single point of access and a single point of query and examination of data and traffic to provide that security in a very tight, so rather than having a really wide security and expensive security deployment, they focus everything on the only available ingress points. And then what you may do is apply your specific policies to that network traffic, that control, who can access what and when. Am I allowed to access this over a VPN 24 hours a day or only on certain days? And if I am coming in over a VPN, do I get the same access as whether if I was coming in from the corporate headquarters? All these would be defined within your policies associated with your landing zone. And then you may turn around and go, well, given that we've got this, and one of the things that Azure does have is a lot of bandwidth. So maybe that becomes our primary point of egress for internet traffic, and everything traverses through that route. Maybe that's the model that you want. And then, so you've got your hub, and you have your ability to connect everyone. It applies that chokehold where you will put all your security in place and monitoring in place, and then you can start scaling out to the environments that will be relevant to your workload. So once upon a time, people used to consider firewalls the perimeter of their network. Now, in many ways, it's probably more accurate to say your identity is the perimeter of the network. And again, having that hub be focused, that focal point for those controls, makes logical sense in a lot of circumstances. It's not the answer for everyone. Some people might only need one landing zone. Some people might need many. What I can say is no two organizations are alike, and no two organizations have the same landing zone specific detailed structure. So having deployed your landing zones, in this case for your payment subscription and your production subscription, you might also say, okay, well, actually I'm hosting web services in the top right hand corner. I've got my DMZ controls and there's some specific controls in there. Maybe I might also put my Azure Virtual Desktop in there. I might put my web services in there. I might put my various listeners in there that are, there are things called Azure functions that you can build within seconds. And I've actually doing a video on this at the moment where I get AI to write the code for me and I publish it and it takes less than a minute and I have no idea what the code says because I'm not a coder. But it works, and it's created a listening point in the cloud that only costs me money when someone accesses that listening point. So for me, it's costing many fractions of a cent. And then you can roll out your environment. So you can see what I mean by the hub and spoke network. This is just an example. There are infinite configurations. What some people might do is put their design consideration is anybody who wants to remotely access any of my virtual machines I've got hosted in the cloud, they can't access it directly from those machines, as in from an administration point of view. You put a jump box, and maybe that jump box sits at the hub, and only the jump box has got permissions to be able to remotely control any of those other machines. Again, allowing you to further focus down your security and put your most stringent enterprise security features at the point, because there's no other way to access this environment unless it's across this link, which is subject to your controls. So I did mention earlier on that about funding. Now, one of the things that is Microsoft do, which is very helpful, is if you are going to Azure, or already in there Azure, but there's additional workloads that you want to take to Azure, they have pots of money available through partners to go and deliver a migration on behalf of a customer, meaning the customer often has to pay considerably less and very often nothing at all for the migration. And so there are multiple steps. What is it you want to do? There's an initial workshop. Microsoft will fund that assessment. Like I say, it might be they only fund 90% of it, but it's a significant pot of free money. It may be that because you want to follow best practice, you want to build out a landing zone. Azure will fund that. Sorry, Microsoft will fund that. It may be that you want to undertake a proof of concept before you scale out further in the cloud. Again, we can build a proof of concept with a set of rules, and when we hit certain milestones, they will release funding. And likewise, when it comes to doing a well-architected review or indeed the migration. So there are plenty of pots of money available. Not everyone qualifies. I mean, as a general rule of thumb, if I said, if it's more than 5 or 6 servers, you'll probably qualify. That's as a general rule of thumb. So why would you seek funding for us? Well, we're actually the #1 in the UK at doing it. As I mentioned before, there's only a handful of partners in the UK that actually have the expert MSP. I mean, there are thousands, tens of thousands probably of CSPs, and to be honest, you could get a CSP from your bedroom. It's not terribly complicated, but expert MSP is profoundly complicated. In fact, we've just completed our audit and passed yet again. And it's our HR processes, it's our use of encryption internally for our systems that we're managing. It's a very detailed examination to make sure that we are delivering against best practice, and we can manage our customers effectively on top of all our knowledge and skills to be able to deliver change. So we are the #1 partner in terms of requesting funding and secured significant amounts of funding for customers to achieve migrations. Our general approach is we adopt something called the zero dependency model is our preferred approach, where you need potentially our help earlier on, and maybe initially you might maintain it, but as we share our knowledge with you, our goal is for you to become self-sufficient, so you do not need ongoing services for us. You only call us in when something is maybe, right, I've been there a year, I've migrated, you help with the migration, you help me with a little bit of support, but now my team are trained and we've had the knowledge sharing, we're managing support, so that dependency on support goes down. But we've got this project where we want to innovate, and then maybe you'll come back to us and say, can you help us with the configuration of Azure's OpenAI or data analytics platform or whatever it may be. So that is our approach. I'm going to pause there and look at that. My timing is impeccable. That's half an hour. So are there any questions, Beth?
No questions. But yeah, if anyone did have any questions at all, then obviously the Q&A bar is there. So
as I mentioned, I think in 30 seconds, according to the schedule, if my clock is correct, I have a longer form document that is publishing on my LinkedIn profile. So feel free to either raise any questions now, or if I go back to my contact details, if you didn't capture them earlier, you can reach out to me either on LinkedIn, on email, on Twitter, and if you've got any follow-ups, please reach out to me. Like I say, I'm not here to sell, I'm just here to share my knowledge. Whether you buy from us or not, it makes no difference. You will get the same amount of support and dedication from me, helping you with your cloud journey. So still no questions?
No questions.
Okay, well, everybody, I think that's it. Have a lovely day. Feel free to reach out to me, and I shall catch you next time. Thank you very much.